Here on Flow FM, we continue the conversation about nuclear energy in Australia or the potential thereof. We're speaking with Helen Cook from GNE Advisory. How are you, Helen?
Morning, Ricky. Very well. How are you?
Great, thank you. Look, we wanted to reach out to you from a legal perspective. You are a lawyer yourself, and some say you've written the book on nuclear law. Is that a fair comment?
I have written a book on nuclear law, yes. I can't say it's a bestseller, but it is. I have written it.
Oh, well, for those that care a lot about it, that's the go-to place. And look, we have in Australia something of a unique situation when it comes to the law surrounding nuclear energy in that it's banned.
Absolutely. We have prohibitions at the federal level and also in a number of Australian states. So we have two pieces of Commonwealth legislation that contain nuclear prohibitions. The first is the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Act, which is the act that set up our nuclear regulatory body. And that act says that this regulatory body is not permitted to license the construction or operation of nuclear power plants or other nuclear fuel facilities in Australia. Now, that act applies to Commonwealth entities only. But we also have another piece of very important legislation at the federal level, which is the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, which is legislation that does really two things. First, it requires ministerial approval for the taking of a nuclear action, which is defined to include the construction and operation of nuclear power plants. And then it actually contains a provision that prohibits the relevant minister from approving any action that involves the construction of nuclear power plants. So at the federal level, we have a prohibition on nuclear energy, and then we also have prohibitions in the Australian states of New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and Tasmania.
That's interesting. So there's several states that have put bans in place as well. We can all assume or speculate why they were put in place. That's a historical lesson. But where does that place Australia compared to, say, other developed economies in terms of laws regarding nuclear energy?
That's a great question, Ricky. So if we can have a look at the G20 as a group of countries representing together 80% of global GDP and the world's major economies, Australia is one of the G20. It's made up of obviously 19 countries plus the EU as a bloc. And if we take those G20 countries, and bearing in mind that the EU is considered here as a bloc, Australia is one of only 5 countries that today does not operate nuclear power plants. But more interestingly, it is the only country, again, taking the EU as a bloc, that has no plans to develop nuclear power plants. So the 4 other countries that currently today do not operate nuclear power plants are Indonesia, Italy, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And if we take them one by one, Indonesia has a very active nuclear energy program. It's done a lot of feasibility studies with all of the main technology providers, and right now it's very interested in small modular nuclear reactors, specifically floating SMRs. Saudi Arabia has, for the last decade, had a nuclear energy program that it's been developing. It's just entered the active phase of its procurement of large reactors, and it also has an SMR program together with the Koreans and the Chinese. Turkey is currently building Russian reactors. And then we have left Italy. Now, Italy has historically operated nuclear power plants. It shut them down shortly after Chernobyl. It has had an active new build program. So pre the Fukushima nuclear accident, it actually planned to have 25% of its electricity generated by new nuclear power plants by 2030. The Italian government held a referendum shortly after, and I mean within months of the Fukushima accident, and that policy was actually voted down. So Italy is the only country that doesn't have plans to develop new nuclear power plants today, but it is lucky in that it neighbours France. So it has the benefit of being able to import electricity from France, and France generates 70% of its electricity from its fleet of more than 50 nuclear power plants.
That's quite intriguing.
Really,
It's intriguing stuff. You've got me interested on this floating SMR scenario as well, but I don't want to lose sort of a critical point here as well that so Australia, what countries have bans like Australia does? Presumably all of those nations that are using it, apart from it, or that are deploying nuclear energy, apart from Italy that's relying on it, do those G20 nations have a ban on nuclear energy itself?
No, they don't. So those countries that I mentioned have no nuclear power plants today but are developing programs or actively building plants. They don't have prohibition. So Australia is the only country in that group, taking the EU as a bloc, that does have a legislated prohibition. Now, within the EU generates 26% of its electricity from nuclear energy, so quite a large component of its overall electricity mix comes from nuclear, but that's from 13 of 27 countries. And you do have countries in the EU that have laws that would prohibit the construction of nuclear power plants. One, for example, is Denmark. And then you have countries that have decided to do things like phase out their existing nuclear capacity, like Germany, and prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like Belgium. Now, these countries even are reconsidering those positions due to issues of energy sovereignty and security, energy prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course also the requirements and the commitments that the EU has made to those carbon emission reduction requirements that they've put in place. So nuclear energy is very much back on the agenda in the EU in quite a big way.
On that one, the EU, this is a sort of a lawyer term, taxonomy, but I understand recently that in the consideration of what's considered green, or you'll know the taxonomy better than I do, the EU, the overarching parliament, has said now nuclear is on the good list, not the bad list, when it comes to addressing climate change.
I like that way of phrasing it, Ricky. That's absolutely the case. And they've gone back and forwards on this for a few years, but yes, recently it has been determined that nuclear energy will be considered within the green energy taxonomy, the framework that is being developed to facilitate the much needed investment in low carbon energy sources in the EU. So nuclear, as you say, is on the good list.
When it comes to countries that are looking to implement nuclear energy that haven't had it before, there's a whole lot of regulatory arrangements that need to be put in place. Can you give some examples? If Australia wanted to go in this direction, what sort of timeline are we seeing in other countries that are moving in that direction? How long does it take to have all the necessary safeguards in place?
Yeah, so the International Atomic Energy Agency has established what they call what's called the IAEA milestones approach in the development of national infrastructure for nuclear energy programs. It's a methodology, if you like, that countries around the world, when they are moving to consider nuclear energy and then implement a nuclear energy program, it's a methodology that they utilise. And the IAEA says that if you implement this methodology, it can take between 10 to 15 years from the day that the country starts to consider whether nuclear energy should be part of its mix to electrons on the grid. Now, that might sound like a relatively long time, but as you say, Ricky, nuclear energy is not an overnight proposition. There are a number of things that need to be put in place to be a responsible and successful utiliser of nuclear energy, and that includes things like laws and regulations, the establishment of institutions, the development of human resource capacity, looking at what project structures might be most beneficial or most successful to deploy nuclear power plants, what electricity market structures are needed, what sites we have and the site studies that need to be done, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to be in a position to be able to procure that technology and then to implement a project successfully. Australia has a world-leading reputation when it comes to our existing legal and regulatory requirements around nuclear safeguards and nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security. And we obviously have our existing regulatory body that regulates our existing research reactor operated by ANSTO. So we already have a lot of the tools that we need, but we would need to do more thinking. We would need to think it would be beneficial if we thought strategically about how to put together a fit-for-purpose nuclear energy program in Australia. And that kind of planning, that does take time.
Now, that sort of timeline might seem overwhelming, but the ability to deploy nuclear energy is now a lot easier. You've just mentioned earlier when we spoke with you about Indonesia looking at floating nuclear power plants. Russia, apparently, according to the Atomic Energy Agency, academic Lomonosov has deployed their first floating nuclear power plant. I thought that was called a nuclear submarine, or is it something different?
No, it's something different. So there is, look, it's a very exciting world out there in the nuclear technology space. There are countries and technology providers that are out there developing the next generation of nuclear technologies, and they're doing really interesting things with them, like proposing that you could put a nuclear reactor on a barge or a ship and it would actually be able to move from place to place where we needed the energy maybe on shorter notice, or it was in a remote community that was hard to access. You could, bring it in on a ship or on a barge. So there's just so much interesting stuff out there in this space, and yes, floating SMRs is one of them.
Well, Helen, we'll have to catch up with you a bit further about some of these developments because there's a whole lot that is happening in this space. As you say, the technology is emerging, but we run out of time today. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Helen Cook from GNE Advisory.
My pleasure, Ricky. Thanks.